Hi, we're going to start a new chapter. We need to push on, and the next chapter is called Complex Numbers. Now, I know straight away, oh my God, it's complex, but listen, it's just a name. Uh, we can work through this, okay? Um, it's not as hard in a sense as it looks if you break it down into simpler bits. And I'm going to try and do this by a series of videos. Um, to try and really break it down to the simplest parts because that's all you need to know. Okay, um, it can often be explained in a really complicated way. So you might decide that what I'm explaining here is complicated, but I can assure you it's I'm trying to break it down into the simplest parts. Okay, so the idea of a complex number is made up of two things: a real part and an imaginary part. Okay, straight away your head's spinning with that idea. So let's just talk briefly about an imaginary part. Let's talk about an imaginary number for a second. I'm going to use my calculator, and I'm just going to try and do a calculation. This is. I'm sure this happened to a majority of you at some point in time, where you might have tried to do a square root of a negative number. Right? Okay. Now when I press equals, uh, I'm getting a math error. Okay, the calculator can't cope with the square root of a negative number. So the square root of any negative number, no matter what I type in here, it can't cope. Okay, and the reason for that is that if you think about the ideas of squares, okay, if I take let's take the number 3 and square it, okay, i.e. that's 3 times 3, I get 9. Okay, that's fine. If I take minus 3 and multiply that by minus 3, so I am doing square of minus 3, I also get 9. There's no way of multiplying a number by itself and getting a negative. Whether it's two positive numbers multiplied together, you get a positive. If you multiply a negative number by itself, you get a positive. There isn't really any way of multiplying a negative number by itself and getting a negative. It just doesn't work. Okay, so the idea of a square root is going in the other direction. The whole point is you're never going to be able to go from a negative and square root it. It just doesn't work. Okay, so some bright spark, I won't go into the history of it, came up with a way of dealing with this. So they said to themselves, right, okay, what we're going to do is we're going to take the square root of minus 1, and we're going to just say it's I. We're going to call it I. Okay, I for imaginary. And what this then allows us to do is play a bit of a game, bit of mucking around with numbers. Now it makes our life a lot easier. Okay, so you don't really need to understand or worry too much about the idea of this, where it comes from. But the key idea is you need to be able to use it. Okay, so let's ask that question again that we had. We had the square root of minus 4, and the calculator said math error. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to use this idea of this letter I to better deal with this square root. So I'll just go the long way, and then I'll show you how to do it the short way. So the idea of the square root of minus 4, well, if we consider the fact that minus 4 is 4 multiplied by minus 1, so we've got the square root of 4 times minus 1. Now, what's the square root of 4? Okay, and what's the square root of minus 1? Well, the square root of 4 is 2. Okay, 2 times 2 is 4. What's the square root of minus 1? Well, we don't know. The calculator says math error. Okay, so we've come up with this idea of calling it instead I. So all of a sudden, we're able to come up with a sort of an algebraic expression. It's called an imaginary number to represent this square root of a negative number. So what hopefully you've realized, or you can realize, I'll point out here, if you think of the square root of 4, the square root of 4 is 2, and because there's a negative in front of it, of that number, okay, it's an imaginary number, so we just call it 2i. So let's do another example. If we have the square root of minus 9, what's the square root of 9? Positive 9. It's 3. Okay, so we just say the square root of minus 9 is 3i. And we can carry on with this, okay, and carry on with this with a variety of any negative number. Even if I go with something that's less obvious. Well, the square root of 2, it's 1.4 something, okay? It's not a nice number, okay? Well, let's just call it the square root of 2i. So what we're coming up with is basically a multiple of I. And what we have is whatever the square root is, with that negative in there, take this negative out to make it an I, okay? And then just have whatever the number is. I can carry on with this, okay? So the square root of minus 25 is going to be 5i. Why? Because 25 square rooted is 5, and because it's a negative number, we can't do it on the calculator, so we just shove this I after it. So we're representing this imaginary number, this number that the calculator can't even work out. We just say, well, look, it's an imaginary number, so we're just going to give it a number and have I after it just to tag it as being an imaginary number. So, I might ask you, okay, what's the square root of minus 36? What's the square root of minus 100? What is the square root of minus 5? So you might want to pause the video for a second, just work those out yourself. So square root of minus 36 is 6i. The square root of minus 100 is 10i. And the square root of minus 5, well, 5 isn't square rooted easily, so we can just write it as the square root of 5i. Hope you got those right. Okay, so that's one skill you have to have. Just this idea of, if you're presented with a square of a negative number, just write it in a sense as a positive number, but just with an I after it. Okay. So moving on then, if we were to look at now this idea of a complex number. So what is a complex number? A complex number is just a mashup of a real part and an imaginary part. Okay, so a complex number, you have a real part and you're adding on to that an imaginary part. So here's an example. We've got 2 minus 5i. So the 2 is the real part, and the minus 5i is the imaginary part. Okay, now there's a negative in between. I suppose we're just adding a negative number. We just don't bother writing that negative, that plus sign in there. It's just 2 and minus 5i. So the 2 is the real part, and minus 5, or you might say minus 5i, is the imaginary part. You're sort of allowed just to look at the number, or you're allowed to take the number with the I with it. So again, minus 1 plus 2i, well, minus 1 is the real part, and 2i is the imaginary part. So, and generally speaking, you'd always write the real part first and the imaginary part second. Okay, so let's go with the number 6. So the 6 is just the ordinary number 6. You learned 6 years ago, right? Okay, well, is there an I part to that? Is there an I just sitting next to it? No, it's just 6. Okay, it's a real number. Is there an imaginary part after it? Is there something I? There isn't. Well, I suppose you could say that there's no I's, 0 I. Okay, so the real part is 6. The imaginary part, well, there isn't one, or we might just say, well, it's 0 I. And lastly, this fourth example, minus 2i. Okay, minus 2i. Is there a real part to it? Is there just a number sitting there? There isn't. Okay, there just seems to be an imaginary part only. So we've got our imaginary part. Sorry, there's minus 2i, Is there a real part? No. Well, we could say the real part is 0, okay, and the imaginary part is minus 2i. Now, just in terms of sort of exam speak, you'll often see what they'll say is, write your number in the form of a plus bi. So all they're saying is whatever that number there is, that's your real part, okay? And whatever this bit here is, this is your imaginary part, okay? It's just a way of just sort of saying, well, write it in that format, okay? So the number 5 could be written as 5 plus 0i, okay? If you wanted to write it like that. Generally speaking, when you're dealing with a imaginary part, a complex numbers question, there's going to be two parts. So it's not often that it comes up with just dealing with just an ordinary real number. Okay. So whenever you're looking at a complex number, it's complex because it's got a real part and an imaginary part. The imaginary part is the bit that has the I. The real part is the other bit, and it's usually written first. Oh. So what I want you to have a go at now is an exercise 7.2. Okay, and what it asks you to do is go through those basic processes. Question 1 is about just being able to write a square root of a negative number in terms of I, and the question 2 is where it's just asking you to identify what is the real part, what is the imaginary part. Okay, and lastly, question 3 is just getting you to again do a little bit of work on writing it in that complex number format where you have the real part and the imaginary part. Okay, so I'll just go through an example of that for question 3. Let's say you had the number 3 plus the square root of minus 49. Okay, well, that's a real number. This here, I can immediately see it's a square root of a negative. Okay, so it's going to be an imaginary number. Well, what's the square root of 49? It's 7. Okay, so I've got 3, that's my real part, and this bit here is 7i. Okay, so what have I done? I've looked at this, realized it's a negative number being square rooted, so I know it's going to be something I. That negative basically turns into a little I, and I just concentrate on the square root of that number, the positive bit. So what's the square root of 49? You can always do that in the calculator. Square root of 49 is 7, so therefore it's 7i. So my complex number is better written as 3 plus 7i rather than 3 plus the square root minus 49.